Today, Boker Tov, today the class is Le'ilui Nishmat Avigdor Chai Avram Ben Meir Tzvi Berachalea, as always. In addition to that, is also for a Refuah Shlema for Halel Miram Bat Rivka Nechama Tziona. And finally today also for Joan Gittel Weiner for her Livin, for her father's Neshama, Le'ilui Nishmat Mordechai Ben Avraham, who's just had his yahrzeit. We are, if in the little booklet, in Perek Yud Aleph, we're on page 62 in the booklet, in the small book, and we're going to start with the paragraph that says Undaber ata al hachataim hamitzuyim. Again, whatever printing you have, it's middle of Perek Yud Aleph. It is after dealing with the food, the topic of food. And now it's going to talk about, we did really kind of ran through at the end last week of having to do with things related to verbal abuse plus. So that's the paragraph that starts, Undaber ata lachataim hamitzuyim. And I'm going to read it. And like last time, I'm going to translate, but this time now I'm going to go into a little bit of depth into some of these things before we even look at the text any further. So let's get started. Undaber ata lachataim hamitzuyim hanoladim mechevrat bnei ha'adam v'kibutzam. Now he says we're going to speak about the various types of sins that arise due to the fact that we're social animals. We interact with people. You know, some of the things that people do wrong, if you lived a life of a hermit, you may not do them wrong because you're not going to be able to. If you don't talk to anybody, you can't speak lashon hara. And if you don't deal with someone in business, you can't cheat them in business. There's just a lot of things that if you were alone, but that's not how Hashem created us. Hashem didn't create us to be hermits. There's no benefit for long-term hermitosity. I just made that word up. We're meant to be involved in people, involved in life, involved with society. Otherwise, Hashem would have had a different makeup for our neshama, our DNA, and everything else. And what are some of those things that happen? Kigon, for example, hona'at devarim, and I'm just loosely translating that right now as verbal abuse. Halbanat panim, embarrassing somebody. Hachshalat ha'iver be'etza, tricking somebody or causing someone to do the wrong thing when you give that individual bad advice on purpose. Rechilut, tale-bearing, gossip. Sinah, hatred. Nikima, taking revenge. Shavuot, it could mean taking Hashem's name in vain. Could mean other things. Devar sheker, telling lies. Chilul Hashem, doesn't need a translation. Ki mi yomar niketi mihem, who can possibly say that they are free from any of those mistakes? Taharti mi'ashma bam, I'm completely pure from any of those. Ki anfehem rabim v'dakim ad me'od, because the various permutations and subcategories, there's plenty of them. Some very fine line between what is okay and what is not. Because to be careful, it needs a lot of work. Remember, this book is not meant something to be you read, understand, and move on with life. Because if you do, you might as well just read something else. It's meant to be used. It's put into practice. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to put every single thing into practice, but at least something. But he admits from the get-go that some of the things we're going to talk about now, as in the past, they're not so easy to do. Look, we all know you don't speak lashon hara. But what about these subcategories? So what I'm going to do is take a look at just a little cutesy thing here. In Germany, I forgot which city, there is this statue. It's meant to be two women. It's not meant to be a shtetl, but in a sense, like shtetl life, gossiping. We talked about lashon hara. We talk about that quite often. We learn about it. And what is difficult to understand when it comes to lashon hara is how come there's so many thick books about it? Because they say, don't talk bad about somebody. It's pretty straightforward. But in truth, we're going to see, sometimes you can't even talk good about somebody. And there's so many subcategories of this idea of lashon hara. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about embarrassing somebody. Most people do not go out of their way to embarrass another individual. And you think about it, it's not that easy to do either, right? But there are things that we could potentially say or do that fall into the category of embarrassing somebody without us even realizing it's a problem. We'll get to that as well. This is supposed to be obviously someone who's blindfolded, but in a sense, someone who's blind. What does it mean we say in the Torah, Hashem says in the Torah, Lifnei iver lo titen michshol. You're not allowed to put a stumbling block before a blind individual. So the truth is, most people don't constantly come in contact with someone who's blind. And who would even think, chas v'chalila, they put something in front of a blind person to make them trip? But the bare minimum, that's what it means. But it's also, if someone is blind to an idea, they're not sure they should do something or not, they come to you for advice. The advice you give, because they're blind to what the answer should be, you have to be very careful in how you give advice. And we're going to see about that also. I was using this to show, nikima, taking revenge. What is the expression? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Okay, it's a cute phrase, but there are times that someone hurts you. It could be love, it could be financially, it could be all kinds of ways. And one of our inner instincts is to want to take revenge against that person. Some people, now Rambam says like this, when it comes to this concept of how you react in certain situations, he says it's not good to have a point where you get angry for the littlest thing. Someone looks at you the wrong way and you explode. It's also not good to be the other end of the spectrum where, and these are not his words, someone beats you up and you say, okay, that's life. You can't be like that. You have to be somewhere in the middle. When it comes to revenge, what does that actually mean? I mean, most people, again, here's the whole point of this paragraph in this chapter, is most people don't seek out to take revenge against somebody, but yet there's still a way we can verbally take revenge that goes against the Torah and is in fact something that falls in the category of not just an Aveirah or a sin, but also some of the subcategories that we'll go against. I'm going to leave this slide for when we get to the topic of Nikima, taking revenge. Okay, so let's continue the text now and let him do the talking instead of me. Hona'at dvarim bichlala. This next paragraph, it says that the concept of verbal abuse includes huledaber bifnei chavero levad. If you're to talk to somebody alone, we're not even talking publicly yet, just to talk to someone alone, sheyevosh mimenu, and he gets embarrassed by what this other person says. How much more so if it's asur to be mevayesh, to embarrass somebody privately? How much more so if you do it publicly? Or to do something that will cause him to get embarrassed. For example, what can cause someone to get embarrassed? You trip somebody because you want to see someone fall and people laugh at him. That's embarrassing. It's what it says in the Gemara. Now here's a really good example. If a person's a Baal Tshuva, a person did not grow up religious, or they were religious, they became not religious, and then became religious again, lo yomar lo, you should not say to that person, Zechor ma'asecha rishonim. Remember when you used to eat chazer? Remember when you used to keep Shabbat? You remember, wow, that's terrible. Or how could you have done something like that? Or you can say it in a very benign way. Like you can say, hey, what was it like to eat chazer? What was it like to have a ham and cheese sandwich? Those kind of questions are asur to ask. Now, again, if you're in a discussion and you're talking with someone who's a chozeh b'tshuva, and you want to say, look, I'd like to ask you a question if it's okay. And I've actually asked the question to many chozeh b'tshuva, what's the one thing they miss the most? And almost always the answer is shellfish, which is interesting. Almost always, and specifically shrimp. So this kosher equivalent ever says that everything that Hashem created that's asur for us to have, there's something mutar for us to have. But you can't go out of your way and say, or go to the guy and say, you used to eat shrimp, didn't you? Right? Because that is a form of verbal abuse. It's embarrassing. I've actually heard this people say about themselves. So listen to this. If a person gets sick, you're not allowed to say to that person who is sick, like the friends, quote unquote, of Eov said to him, remember, no one got sick or died for no reason, meaning Implication is, oh, you got sick? You must have really sinned to do something wrong for God to punish you to get sick. It's terrible, terrible thing to say. Another place that this comes up, not these words, but in a similar fashion, has to do with the Shiva house. People say the stupidest things in a Shiva house. If you don't have what to say, keep your mouth quiet. Don't talk. By the way, that's halacha. You don't talk until the mourner talks. But besides that, don't say stupid things. God forbid to someone who's lost a child to say something, some very hurtful things I've heard. The worst, I wasn't present for it. But I heard the story from my father, Yesharim, who witnessed it himself. There was my father was a rabbi at one point in Kansas City, Missouri. And one of the local families had a tragedy. A young child was killed in a car accident. And the rabbi, he was the assistant rabbi, and the rabbi of the shul came to the Shiva house and basically said, I mean, how do you say the words? Don't worry, you will get over this one day. What a horrible thing to say. Fine. A few years later, that rabbi lost a child in a car accident. I'm not saying it's mina keneged mina, that's all Hashem, but then this rabbi was sitting Shiva, and he happened to see, my father came to him or talked to him on the phone. I don't know what the situation was. And the rabbi said, now I understand how horrible it was what I said years ago. Evidently, it's stuck in his craw. But in any case, people say dumb things. Partly it has to do with, they don't know what to say. So when you don't know what to say, you kind of say whatever comes out of your mouth. People abhor silence. One of the tricks in negotiation, when you're trying to negotiate with somebody, whether it's a deal or to do something, one of the tricks you use or can be used is silence. You know, someone says something and offers, and you just go, okay. And you don't say anything because people don't like silence. They have to fill it. So they'll keep talking. And when they keep talking, they offer more or they lower a price, whatever it might be. So people don't like silence. So that happens very often in a Shiva house when people, there's silence, there's a break, and they just want to say something and they just don't think. There are books, by the way, about what you say and don't say to mourners, both at the Shiva house and during the course of the year. But that is, and I'm mentioning all this, that's a form, we don't even think about it. It's a form of onat dvarim. It's a form of verbal abuse. No one goes out of their way to walk into the Shiva house and say, oh, I'm going to make them feel worse. Obviously, chas v'shalom. But people do, unfortunately. Let's continue. Now, there are other ways that we can cause verbal abuse, which we would maybe never think about. If someone was, the example here is some person who has donkeys was looking for grain to feed their animal or to transport, you can't say to someone, go to so-and-so because he sells grain. And he knows he never did. He never sold grain. Send him what we call a wild goose chase. I'm going to give you a modern day example of how people go against this almost on a daily basis. You're walking down the street, you're in Yerushalayim, you're walking down Yafo, and someone stops you and says, hey, do you know how to get such and such a place? And you're not sure, but you give directions like you're walking Google Maps and you're walking Waze. When you send somebody to a place and you say, this is how you get there, and you're not sure, you've actually done, if it's not accurate, it's a form of verbal abuse because you're sending them on a wild goose chase. You're using your words to, in a sense, not directly purposely, but to hurt the person. So if I am not 100% sure, I will always say, look, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that, or better you ask somebody else. But the old joke, yashar, you know, like that, sofa alam smola, it doesn't work. Okay, it's cute, but it doesn't work halachically. You can't do that. You can't give someone directions for sure if you know they're the wrong directions. And if you're not sure, you have to say, I'm not sure. Verbal abuse is worse than the abuse of money, meaning that you cause someone a loss or you make someone think, we talked about this, that you want to buy something from them when you don't. Now, one of the things we did not mention here is what we still would all picture as verbal abuse. Stupid idiot, you fool. God forbid a husband saying to a wife or wife saying to a husband on Shabbat, and especially with company, it makes it even worse. It's the worst challenge I ever had. You burn everything. Same old slop. All these things that are just cringeworthy. Just even say the words and think about such a thing. But unfortunately, I'm sure you do know that it happens more often than we'd like to believe. That is verbal abuse, mental abuse, going a little bit now to a bit more of an extreme, a controlling spouse. I'll give you a true story. There is a girl, I don't know her. I just know the story from a friend of the girl. There was a girl who was going on a date. This goes back a number of years. And she was on a date with a guy, and she had gone to the bathroom and left her phone on the table. And when she came back, she happened to notice he was just putting it back on the table. And it was after, I think it's the second date. And she stopped seeing him and went back to a teacher of hers who had given her a class in Kita Yudbet in 12th grade and said, one of the red flags when you're dating is if you're not at the table and the boy you're out with or the girl you're out with picks up your phone and does something with it, you're done. The date is over. You do not see that person anymore. It turns out this guy had a reputation for being a control freak. I don't mean, there are plenty of control freaks. That's not a matter of abuse. But I'm talking about where, who are you? Who are you talking with? What time you're going to be home? You got to check in with me. I need to know where you are. I will tell you who your friends are. I will tell you where you can go. That's the extreme. Mental cruelty, verbal abuse. So the upshot was that this guy, she was very, very happy, of course, that she was given this tip, this red flag that when you're on a date and this person, if it's your spouse and they're picking up your phone to check something, also maybe not okay. I try not to ever take my wife's phone to look at it unless she's, said, check something or do something, because it's still a sense of privacy. You're not allowed to read somebody else's mail. You're not allowed to read somebody else's email. You're not allowed to look on a bus, look over at someone's shoulder to read their texts. All that is asur, completely. The reading of the text and the reading of the mail is Yesharim de Rabbeinu Gershom. One of the things that we know Rabbeinu Gershom instituted, of course, was that by Ashkenazim, that a man cannot marry more than one wife, but among them is that you cannot read someone else's mail. Had Rabbeinu Gershom had email in his days and WhatsApp, he would have said the same thing. Can't do it. It's asur. That's not verbal abuse. That's other thing. That's about that. There's other stuff involved. But here, and I know I took it a little bit to the extreme, we talk about mental cruelty. It could be all kinds of things. And sadly, I have seen this plenty of times. Parents do this to their children when it comes to education. Kid comes home with an 87 on a test. That's all. It wasn't a 90. It wasn't 100. Stupid. It happens. Parents call their kids names. They belittle. Doesn't mean you don't have to say, wow, 87, you must be like Einstein. You're the most smart, most unbelievable genius in the world. You don't do that either. That doesn't make any difference. That doesn't help a child. But you do, especially the kids struggling. I've always said, and it's true, I'm sure among most educators, that a student who is not the greatest, who struggles and really works at it and gets a 67 on a test, it's much more meaningful than the kid that everything comes easy to and gets a 93. He didn't even study for the test. Okay, he got 93 because that's so-and-so. There were certain families in my class when we were growing up in school in Chicago, certain families that we knew that it was always family-wide. There were three brothers and all three were literally geniuses. So, okay, he's the one who always got the 100. He's the one who always got the top of the grade, who always got the A's, fine. But the kid that has to struggle, but finally does something and does better than they did, and they're not failing, and even if it's just a little above failure, that deserves encouragement. The opposite is onat dvarim. The opposite is verbal abuse. When you knock the kid down a peg, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your child, whether it's a neighbor, whoever it might be very careful with your words. They used to say, we used to grow up and heard sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It is exactly the opposite. Psychologists have shown and studies have shown over the years that the scars that people suffer from verbal abuse last much longer than scars from physical abuse. I'm not talking about someone who was abused. That's different. I'm talking about someone takes punches me in the face, God forbid, and hurts and breaks my jaw, and I have to have surgery and all. Okay, eventually I'll get over that physically with physical therapy and surgery. I don't want to save myself on somebody else. Sony Yisrael. But when someone embarrasses you and someone makes you feel bad, that gets into your core. That becomes a part of who you are. And you need to often, if you're understand well enough yourself, you're in tune with yourself to have someone help you through that. I'm sure I've told this story before, but I doubt in this context. I have an uncle who passed away a number of years ago. We were already living here, so it's in the last, let's say, 12 years. Wonderful individual, my mom's oldest brother, religious guy, davened 3 times a day, learned Torah, whatever. It was a normal guy. But he died when he was, I don't know if he was even 80 years old yet. But from the time of his bar mitzvah until the day he died, anytime he got called up to the Torah, just to make Birchot HaTorah, Baruch Hashem Borach, he shook like a leaf. Because at his bar mitzvah, the rabbi, the shul, made fun of how he made the bracha. Now, I don't know if he did it publicly or not. It'd be worse, obviously, if it was public. But even if he went over to him and said, made fun of him because he made a mistake or whatever it was, that came back to him every single time he went up to the Torah. So we have to be very careful with our words. To say, oh, don't say something bad to somebody. Okay, it doesn't take the Mesilat Yesharim to tell you more than just a couple lines, but we have to understand the depth to which we sometimes use words. As Yosef HaTzadik said, as the Sar HaMashkim said, the butler to Paro, Et chata'ai ani maskir hayom. I will, I mentioned my sin today. Dafka yesterday. I wasn't even thinking today to say this, but it just popped in my head. I was sitting, I teach, and I meet boys, as you know, and my office, my room is pretty much the Beit Midrash. It's pretty empty usually, and that's where I work kids one-on-one or one-on-3. And Dafka yesterday, there was somebody else in the Beit Midrash who's been in there before, one of the students in whatever class, and he's always making noises. And finally I said to him, like in a very, not very nice way, what's the matter? Do you have some medical problem that keeps making you do this stuff? And he started lacing into me, and that's how do you say something like that? And I sat back down, and I don't think 10 seconds went by. This is just yesterday. And he went back, and he was with a teacher and 3 or 4 other students. And I went back, and I said, whatever, David, his name's not David. David, ma siti. I said, Rega, lo sita klum. You didn't do anything. I said, I'm coming here to apologize. You're right, I'm wrong. Well, his whole face changed. And he said, I also apologize to you for making the noises. So it is you got to be very careful with what you say and how you say something to somebody, where and when you say something. People need sometimes to be told what to do or to change. He's going to come up to that in a moment. But when it's not in a situation of hochech tochech damitecha, you should rebuke your neighbor or your friend and tell them what they're doing wrong in a proper way. But it's just stam. Got to be very careful. Let's take a look at when it continues now. Even more so, forget when it's just one-on-one, how much more so if you do something publicly to embarrass somebody or to cause them other pain. We learned explicitly in Pirkei Avot, a person who publicly embarrasses another person, has no portion in the world to come. That's a pretty strong condemnation. That's pretty strong. All the gates of heaven, of tefillah to God have been closed or sealed or locked, with the exception of people who are the victims of abuse. Hashem always hears their prayer. So there's other versions of this particular statement. Doesn't mean only Hashem hears your prayer if you're a victim of abuse. That's not what it means, but it's a concept we're talking about here. Anything that Hashem, so to speak, needs to give a person a patch, so to speak, something wrong that he does through a shaliach, through a malach. Except when someone hurts someone, verbally abused them, that the person who did the verbal abusing, again, whatever level it's at, Hashem himself takes it out on the person. And furthermore, they said 3 types of people. The curtain is not closed before them. Again, the concept of the gates being open or closed to Hashem for tefillah. One of them is someone who is a victim of abuse. Now, here's what I was talking about before. Even when you have to do a mitzvah, let's say, for example, I need to tell someone, or you need to tell someone they're doing something wrong halachically, okay, whatever it is. My classic example I've mentioned, again, I don't know which class I say what in sometimes, but there was a Kiddush on Shabbat morning. For quite a while, I noticed in Chicago, There's this one guy who, when he make kiddush, he'd take a little shot glass, he'd fill it with grape juice, make kiddush, and then make his mezonot. And I went over and I said, look, and here's how I approached it. I said, look, I know you would like to know. So I'm going to tell you, I wouldn't necessarily go out of my way to tell somebody else, but I know you'd want to know that when you make kiddush on a shot glass Shabbat morning, you can do it on, if it's schnapps, whiskey or something like that, because it has chashivut, it has importance when it's just a shot glass. But a shot glass of grape juice or wine is not chashuv. It doesn't have importance to it. It has to be at least, let's say, 3 ounces approximately. So you have to have more. So he thanked me, and from then on, he always made kiddush. So technically, he made very priyagef. That's the basic thing you have to do for Shabbat morning, but you have to have a certain amount. So in order to do that, I told him, make sure you have a regular kos or a cup of some, or do it on schnapps. So that's when you do hocheach tocheach damitecha. I could have done it differently. I'm standing there. I could have said, Bernie, don't you know anything? Come on. You got to use this common sense. This is what wine and grape juice, a little bit. There's no chashivut to that. You know that. How well do you think that would go over? Take a look. You shall surely rebuke your friend, your people. You mean to say to such an extent that even if his face changes, what does that mean? Like you caused the person public embarrassment? That's to that such an extent? Talmud lamar v'lo tisa alav chet. You shall not bear a sin. What does that mean? It means that you cannot. We've talked about mitzvah haba b'avera, like stealing a lulav and making a bracha on it. You can't do that. So too, you cannot do the mitzvah of tochacha, of telling someone to change something without, and also at the same time embarrassing the person. There are certain exceptions. But begadol, I was going to say begeneral, begadol, you need to do it in the proper way without embarrassing the person. From all these things, these examples he's given, you can see how wide these tentacles spread, so to speak, my words, not his, of all these different ideas, and also how careful you have to be with this. The next topic he gives is about giving advice. The word advice, by the way, the shoresh, the etymology of the word is AVIC or AVEC, I forgot, which is the word for opinion. If I ask you your opinion on something or I ask you advice on something, it's 2 different things. But the shoresh of that word of advice is opinion. So people sometimes will ask your opinion on something. Sometimes people would ask your advice on something. Depending on your profession, sometimes if you're a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, a rabbi, a social worker, many different things, they'll come to you for advice that you may be able to give to that person. It is sometimes a burden that one has to bear, because sometimes you realize that you're giving advice that can literally change, hopefully for the better, another person's life. When we say Ashamnu Bagadnu, now it's been long enough that I've said it, I've been saying it in Lashon of the Nusach Hadot Mizrach. I really don't remember if this is included in Ashkenaz or not, but it's Ya'atz Nura, that we gave bad advice. Why are we saying Al Chet, or why are we saying Ashamnu? Why would we hit ourselves to say we gave bad advice? We gave bad advice. It's just, it wasn't the best advice to give. Like, nobody's given bad advice before, and it's a sin. No, it doesn't mean that you went out, that you gave advice that was no good. It meant, number one, that you just flippantly gave advice without thinking about it, or worse, and what he's going to talk about now, is purposely giving bad advice. I have the zechut of being able to talk to lots and lots and lots of people over the last 22 years or whatever, officially, and before that even unofficially, for advice or other things. And I always look at it as an extremely important action. I have a rule, and I mention this to people sometimes when I'm talking with them, and he's actually going to mention a similar idea. My rule is as follows. When I give someone advice, my advice is what I would give to myself or to my children. Because why would I give advice any differently? Why would I want to be any less interested in your welfare and your well-being in your life than my own or my own family's? That doesn't make any sense, because technically we are all family. Not technically, we are. Now we all family. If you're following in Tanya, you'll see where this is like one koma, one story of Jews from top to bottom. We're all one goof, one body. So when a person goes out of their way to give bad advice, that would be what netinat etzah is going to talk about now. But inyan netinat etzah is we're talking about giving bad advice. Why would someone give bad advice? Think about that. It's kind of silly, right? Hey, should I buy a ticket to Mifala Pais, or should I buy a hamburger to eat because I haven't eaten in 2 days? Oh, I don't know. Go get the ticket for Mifala Pais. Why would you do something silly like that? So obviously there have to be reasons why a person would give bad advice. Give you one example, give you a couple examples, and we'll see in the text. Let's say there's a guy who's single, and he's got an eye on a girl, and he likes her. He was thinking about asking her out. That same day, a friend of his comes over and said, I was thinking of asking so-and-so out. It happens to be the girl that this first guy is thinking about. And he said, what do you think about my asking her out? Now, if he says, look, honestly, I was thinking about asking her out, but here's what I say, that's fine. It's disclosure. But if he says to her, you don't want to do that. She I can't say why, it's lashon hara. Just, you don't want to go out with her. Now that falls in this category. That's giving bad advice on purpose, because you have an agenda. Once you have an agenda that's self-serving because you want to go out with that person, that is a problem. Let's say someone comes to you and says, I'm thinking of buying a piece of property. And what do you think? Should I invest the money in the property or not? And I say to that person, the truth of the matter is that property, there are all kinds of problems with the land. I know that they found all kinds of contaminants in the soil. I don't know any of this stuff. Obviously, I'm just making this up, but you probably don't want it. But why am I saying that? Because I know that my next door neighbor is interested in buying that property. I'm trying to save it for that guy, right? I'm trying to help him out. Again, if I say, look, it's so crazy you asking about this, somebody else is asking the same thing, and here's what I said, that's fine. Again, you're giving legitimate advice, good advice. Should I buy such and such a stock? You have inside information, let's say, and you can't disclose, obviously, so you got to be very careful what you say. You got to be very careful what you say. As an accountant, as a lawyer, doctor, a rabbi, social worker, all these ideas, psychologist, a psychiatrist, all these professions. And even if it's a person who's not a professional, just a neighbor asks you a question. If you have a nigiyah, if you have an interest, some self-interest in it, that it's gonna warp or twist your advice for that person, unless you disclose, you fall into this category here of giving bad advice, and it falls into a form of verbal abuse, because you're not being honest. You're not being honest, and you're purposely misdirecting that individual. Again, if you start out with the caveat that, look, I really don't know, I'm going to give you my best advice. Truth of the matter is that it may affect me, so it might affect the way I give you advice. Okay, I did have a situation. There was a guy who lived in the neighborhood who I thought was physically abusing his kids, not sexually, but physically, smacking them around, which is not good either. Pushing into walls. And finally I decided, because there was somebody who came to me from the shul and said, I think something's wrong there. And finally I decided I had enough, and I called DCFS, because you could report it anonymously. So I called, and an officer came out that same day. I think it was actually Shabbat that they came the next day. And let's say Shabbat, I got a call from the guy, and I saw his name come up on caller ID. I said, oh my God, how could they have told him that I called? So it turns out he was calling me for advice. What do? I got called by DCFS. They want to do an investigation. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to tell him that I'm the one that called, right? So there, I'm allowed to keep my mouth shut and give him advice, because I want the advice to be mut'am, so that it will be helpful for the kids. I said, look, you got to really cooperate. You have to do this. And by the way, just you should know that I've noticed a couple things, whatever it might be. I don't remember what I said anymore, but it was kind of ironic that he came to me. So obviously I have the giyut. I have I'm self. I could have said, oh, you know what? Forget about it. Just don't worry. Don't even cooperate with them, or just do whatever I could have said in order to protect my own privacy. Okay, but I didn't do that. just as an aside, if you or anybody you know ever suspects that there's something going on, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, spousal abuse, anything like that, you have not only a right, but a chiyuv to report the proper channels. You do not have the right to start spreading rumors. You do not have a right to put a thing on Facebook. You do not have a right to start besmirching that person publicly. That's rechilut, that's lashon hara, because there's nothing you know for sure. Even when you know it for sure, unless someone you tell can do something about it, it's lashon hara. But you do have a chiyuv, you have a responsibility, a requirement, putting aside that certain people are going to call mandated reporters, that you have to by law, civil law, but by halacha, we're all mandated reporters. See, as they say something, say something. And whether it's to revacha, to the police, to whomever, to a teacher, to a rabbi, to a therapist, to a doctor, to somebody who can do something about it or can at least guide you where to go with that information. You have such a chiyuv. Okay, what I think I'll do is I think I actually said a lot of what he's going to say in this coming paragraph, but we're going to go back to this paragraph Bezrat Hashem next week. We'll start next week with the idea of giving advice, bad advice, and then we'll talk about what is rechilut and lashon hara, and also what is considered taking revenge. That'll be upcoming episodes, Bezrat Hashem. Hope you all have a wonderful day.